Good evening and welcome to From the Stacks from the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We have a special treat for you tonight. We often discuss the issues surrounding global climate change, global warming, things of that sort. We discuss the science. We often discuss the economics of that. Tonight's guest, Patricia Adams, is a specialist particularly in China policy, and as an environmentalist herself and someone who works with Probe International, a Canadian organization that has been at the forefront of much environmental activity, she has done a lot of research into how China is using fears of climate change to further its own agenda of becoming the world's #1 superpower by 2049. 100 years after the Communist Revolution took over China. So she will be our guest. We'll be introducing her in just a moment. But first, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the Cornwall Alliance. We are, as many of you who've viewed us in the past already know, a network of just under 70 scholars. About a third are natural scientists, including some of the world's top climate scientists. About a third are economists, specializing, most of them, in either environmental or developmental economics. And about a third are theologians, philosophers, ethicists, ministry leaders. And we work to educate the public and policymakers on three things simultaneously and intertwined. The gospel of Jesus Christ, that sinners like me can be reconciled to the Holy God by grace alone, through faith alone, in the substitutionary atoning death and resurrection of Christ alone. And through that, our ability, by being reconciled to God, to learn to think about and understand and use his world in a way that pleases him and that he intends. All of this is to further what we call biblical earth stewardship, or the fulfillment of the mandate that God gave to humankind in Genesis 1:28 to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and everything that moves on the face of the earth. That dominion not being an exploitative, rapacious sort of a dominion, but rather one that reflects God's own activity, since we are made in God's image. An activity in which God brought everything out of nothing, light out of darkness, order out of chaos, life out of non-life, abundant variety of life, and instructed every part of life, every kind of life, to multiply and fill its niche in the earth. So our activity as stewards and as people given dominion over the earth should be geared toward enhancing the fruitfulness, the beauty, and the safety of the earth, to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors. And then also, we're very concerned about economic development for the poor. And we recognize, through a combination of our own biblical, theological, and even anthropological work in terms of human psyche, human incentives, and the like, that, and also through economic history, that poverty is best overcome by a combination of social institutions, which we would summarize as private property rights, free trade, entrepreneurship, limited government, and the rule of law, what many people refer to as free market economics, but free within the bounds of basic fundamental morality, found, for example, in the Ten Commandments. But also, in addition to these social institutions, what is absolutely necessary, indispensable to lifting and keeping any whole society out of poverty, is access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy at scale. Massive amounts of energy, instant on demand, 24/7, 365, without interruption. And this is crucially important to lifting and keeping people out of poverty. And unfortunately, much of the policy offered to quell what some people consider to be dangerous man-made global warming through CO2 emissions using fossil fuels would rob people of that sort of abundant, affordable, reliable energy, and thus slow, stop, or reverse the climb out of poverty for the billions of people in the world who still live in significant poverty and probably roughly 2 billion people in the world who have either no electricity at all or only very intermittent, unreliable electricity. So we're concerned to address all of those issues, and Patricia Adams from Probe International has brought particular light on the role that China is playing in all of this. She's done it in 2 different studies that both have been published by the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Previous study a couple of years ago was called The Red and the Green, China's Useful Idiots. The Red and the Green. That is available for sale through Cornwall Alliance's online store, cornwallalliance.org/shop. But her more recent study is called China's Energy Dream. China's Energy Dream. And in this study, she shows just how Chinese policy is sort of in a judo-like maneuver, using the West's preoccupation with fighting global warming through reducing CO2 emissions by reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. China is using this to weaken the West, both economically and militarily. And at the same time, while it is making claims that it is helping to mitigate global warming, in fact, it's doing nothing of the sort. It is actually increasing its use of fossil fuels in totally gigantic ways, has been for years and will continue doing that for many years to come. So if you would like to receive a free copy of this newer study, China's Energy Dream, all we ask you to do is to go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And as you fill out the donation form, and you may give any amount you wish, however much or however little, doesn't matter at all, regardless of the amount that you give, as our way of saying thank you, we'll send you a free copy of this if you simply, in the comments field in the donation form, write in promo code 22-01 or the title, China's Energy Dream. We'll send you a free copy of it, and 100% of your donation, no matter how large or small, will be tax deductible. Okay, so enough of that. It's time to bring Patricia Adams, the author of these 2 studies, in along with us here. Glad to introduce you to her. She and I have just had a lot of fun chatting before we went live. And Patricia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Calvin. It's a pleasure.
Patricia, a while ago, I learned from another, podcaster, live streamer, that it's a whole lot more fun, a whole lot more informative to ask people to introduce themselves than for me to introduce them. So that's what I'd like you to do. Figure you've just walked into some group somewhere and nobody knows you, but they have gathered to hear you a bit. So tell us about yourself. Take a couple of minutes and give us your background, what you do, why you do it, what motivates you, and what do you think are some of your top values?
Well, that's an interesting introduction. My academic background is economics, and indeed I studied development economics, which you are concerned about.
Yes.
I have lived in different countries. I lived in the Caribbean for a couple of years where I taught economics, and also in Africa, where I worked on various projects as an economist. I've worked for different research aid agencies and engineering companies. And eventually, I realized that what I really wanted to do was work for an environmental organization, because I was very concerned about, in particular, about the relationship between the poor and forest resources. And after being in Africa, I came back to Canada and I found this organization called Energy Probe. And they were they were starting a new program on foreign aid and the potential damage that foreign aid was doing to the environment in third world countries. And so I started working with them in 1980, and I've been there ever since. And uh, our concern is of course the environment. We start by being concerned about the environment. In the case of China, I first got involved in China because the Canadian government financed a feasibility study for the Three Gorges Dam, which is the largest one in the world. And
Yes.
there was a large network of groups around the world, many in the US, who were concerned about hydro dams. And we said, okay, we'll take on Three Gorges because the Canadian government's going to do this feasibility study. And they did. And we managed to get it through, it's the equivalent of your Freedom of Information Act. It's our Access to Information Act. It was a bit of a battle. We got it. It was a huge study. And the government said this is the best feasibility study that has ever been done in the world for a large development project. And we said, okay, we'll go through it. And we organized a team of experts around the world who went through the study. And we published a book called Damming the Three Gorges: What Dam Builders Don't Want You to Know. And based
Yeah.
on that book and that review of the feasibility study, we filed complaints against the engineering firms for negligence and incompetence. They took a lot of chances with, for example, reservoir-induced seismicity, with the number of people that they were going to displace because of the reservoir and so on. So our concern is what lies behind the environmental destruction. Why does it happen? It's not normal for people to destroy their environment. Something's going
Yeah.
on. People don't have the power to get the information about it. They don't have the legal right. Perhaps their property rights are not being respected. There may be cross subsidies in financing. There may be moral hazard. So we're really, really interested in the sort of legal and economic conditions behind environmental destruction. So we start with environmental issues, and then we ask these deeper questions. And in the case of China, we've worked now for 30 plus years with absolutely wonderful, fabulous researchers in that country, and they're really just a delight to work with. They have just a huge amount of information, of course, and great insights. And of course, they're now very much constrained in their ability to do their research and to publish it.
Yeah.
So that's
Um,
maybe an indirect way of getting at this.
no, that's very good. I don't want us to get off on the particular tangent here, but you mentioned something that I think is quite interesting, and sort of a contrast with what I see from a lot of different environmental NGOs. And that is, you mentioned, environmental pollution, environmental degradation is not normal. It's not what we would expect from people. And that seems to me to suggest that that without unnatural incentives, we wouldn't see that. And an awful lot of environmental NGOs seem to think you'll never have a clean, healthful, beautiful environment in the absence of huge amounts of government regulation. Now, I recognize the need for some government regulation. I mean, after all, it's just like any other part of human behavior. If you don't make murder criminal, it's likely to happen more often than if you do. If you don't make theft criminal, it's likely to happen more often than if you do. And similarly, if you don't make environmental degradation criminal, or at least civilly liable, it's likely to happen more often than if you do. And yet, I seem to be hearing you suggest that people don't just naturally foul their own nests, and that maybe sometimes government action can have the opposite effect of improving the environment. Is that appropriate?
Yes, absolutely. One of my colleagues at Probe wrote a book called Environmental Defense, sorry, Property Rights in the Defense of Environment. And
Huh.
she goes through many, many examples where people use property rights to protect their environment. And what typically happens is the common law property rights are superseded by statutory law. So these are
Yeah.
cases where governments come in and will make a decision to pollute a river, for example, because they want to create a certain number of jobs. We have many famous cases in Canada, for example, involving pulp mills and so on. So it very often the environmental destruction happens when the government, for political reasons, makes a decision that they're going to support a project that overlooks and overrides the environmental rights of the citizens who are affected by it. The Three Gorges Dam, I think, is a good example of that. So
Yeah.
the dam displaced about 1.2 to 1.8 million people. We don't know the precise number for sure. You would never get a dam that big in a democratic country. Our governments certainly do build dams. They often don't work very well. They're often boondoggles. Um, and often usually they go ahead with government subsidies. But
Yeah.
you really would never get something that big, displacing 1.2 million people in a democratic country, because the government would be thrown out of power. So there's an
Yeah.
example of a government making a decision that for all kinds of political reasons that it wants to build this dam. And then, of course, what happens is foreign financiers get involved and they say, well, the dam's going ahead anyway, and we want a piece of the action, and we want to supply the turbines, or the earth movers, or the computer systems, or whatever it happens to be. And so then they get the what we call export credit agencies. Yours is called the Export Import Bank. Ours is called Export Development Canada, um, and they will finance the foreign firms to actually get the contracts to build the dams, which would never be built in our countries because
Yeah.
the governments would be thrown out of power. So
Yeah.
these are the kinds of subsidies that we don't like. We
Hmm.
if you're going to build a dam, negotiate,
Yeah.
and that leads to all kinds of innovation, and it leads to adaptation of, for example, in this case, hydro dam technology. So
Hmm.
there are solutions.
Yeah.
You get a lot of people who will say, well, do you want to send us back to the caves? Of course not. The whole point here is to find the recipe for innovation and advancement of the human condition. People want to be more comfortable. They want to be more secure. They want to spend time with their families. Um, and what we need to do is to be able to innovate so that we can do that, meet
Yeah.
their physical needs um, without destroying the environment. And very often
Yeah.
governments get in the way. Very often governments create the problems.
And you would be saying the same thing about the building of any major sort of
Yes.
an energy infrastructure. Negotiate. Make sure that you are acting in a manner that is considerate of the people who live in that area, the people who are downwind or downstream, and so on.
Yeah.
This is something that I think is really crucial. Um, some of what you said there just reminded me actually of a small booklet that I wrote called "Is Capitalism Bad for the Environment?" So I'd like to send you a copy of that. I'll do that after the program
Yes.
here. But that also is
Thank you.
available through Cornwall Alliance's online store. And again, so many people think that somehow or other capitalism or private enterprise, private property even, is the big threat to the environment. And I actually think the other way around. I often will put the point to people in a sort of a humorous and very simple way. Um, why do you find graffiti on public bathroom walls and not on your bathroom wall at home? Well, that's because nobody really has any incentive to take care of the public bathroom walls. But your bathroom wall at home, well, that's part of your house. And if you own your house, you have an incentive to make it nice so that if you eventually resell, you'll get a nice price for it. And even if you don't own, if you're renting, well, you have an incentive to keep the place decent, because if you don't, you'll lose your damage deposit when you move somewhere else. So, private property, private responsibility is really crucially important to good environmental stewardship. Well, at, go ahead.
I was just going to make the comment that I think also that markets are very much like environments. When
Yes.
markets function well, they're diversified. There aren't monopolies. There's good
Right.
feedback. There's great information, and the outcomes are good. And
Yeah.
they're dynamic. They're very dynamic, and nobody can really know for sure how all the decisions that are being made and all of the forces that are at work in a either in an economy or an environment or an ecosystem. So there are a lot of similarities there, which I wish environmentalists would appreciate.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Uh, well, something just flitted right through, and I've lost it. Well, uh, we do need to get to talking about your
Yes.
articles here, your papers, and I'm going to start off just with a quote from the very beginning, the executive summary of China's energy dream. In the second paragraph there, you have a pretty bold statement. China uses the climate agenda both as a way to strengthen its economy and as a weapon for weakening other countries. It now monopolizes the global wind and solar industries, although its own renewable energy infrastructure, as everywhere, is unreliable. And you continue. But that first sentence there, that it's using the climate agenda to strengthen its economy and as a weapon, weakening other countries. Just summarize for us how that happens, and then we'll start to get into some more details as we move farther along through your paper.
Well, President Xi's agenda is, of course, world domination by 2049, but he's got to stay in power, and for that he needs fossil fuels. He must have fossil fuels, and in order to get them, and in order to um, secure the not only the resources and the sources of them, because and we can get into this, but they do have a shortage in China, with the exception of coal. Um, they it would benefit them a great deal if we reduced our use of fossil fuels. I don't think it's going to happen, but he would love for that to happen because that means more for China. Um, Let me just back up a little bit and say that really the number one concern of the Chinese Communist Party is to stay in power. How do they do that? They keep the factories running, they keep people employed, they make sure people have heat, which they, in the winter, which they don't always do successfully. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they make sure the lights go on, the traffic lights work, elevators work, and so on. And so, in order to do all of that, they need energy. Um, and so that is driving a lot of their agenda, their policies. And of course, you hear the Chinese Communist Party members more and more talking about energy security. They are very
Yeah.
worried because they do not
Yeah.
have energy security, and they're very concerned about that. So the more that they can get us to get off fossil fuels, and of course, the more that they can get us to buy their renewable energy technologies, they certainly would make money with if we would do that. Um, uh, but they also would benefit from a reduced demand on our part for fossil fuels and more for them. It's
Yeah.
as the famous general Sun Tzu said, war is about deception, and that's what
Yes.
they're trying to do, hoping that we will follow what our prime minister in this country would like to do, which is net zero, to get to net zero emissions and to reduce our use of fossil fuels dramatically.
Yeah. Um, At the risk of another tangent here, but I think this is important. You mentioned that China's aim, or Xi's aim, is for China to become, the dominant superpower by 2049. That's it's kind of unusual to pick an odd number like that. Ordinarily, it'd be a
Mhm.
multiple of five, or maybe even a multiple of 10. Uh, why 2049? And granted that Xi, at his present age, is somewhat unlikely to even still be around in
Right.
2049. Uh, why is he himself personally so concerned about this?
Well, 2049 would be the 100-year celebration of 100 years of the Communist Party being in power. That's when they took over
Uh-huh.
mainland China. So 2049 has all kinds of propagandistic purposes, and really, China and certainly the Communist Party depends on propaganda, of course, and they depend on, I think, whipping the population up into a sort of anti-foreign frenzy. I think that's where some of their strength comes from. Now, of course, not everybody in China buys that, and many people in China, citizens want to understand the West and are very interested in our values and our products and so on. Um, they're very curious, like anybody, anywhere in the world.
Hmm.
So, but I think that aiming for 2049, it's sort of like him saying, "Well, we're going to take Taiwan back by 2020." Well, 2020 passed, and then we're going to take them back by 2022. And it's a way of sort of whipping up nationalist sentiment in the country and to
Hmm.
rally the public. And he has to rally the public. I mean, he's not secure. He's not secure within the Communist Party. There are people who disagree with him, and of course, there are lots of people in the public who also disagree with him, and they manage to discuss things with each other sometimes, and not always safely. There were recently a large group of human rights lawyers were arrested for having a meeting to discuss the human rights situation, and many of them are now in jail. So um, I think this is why he's doing it. Also, I think that there is a lot of nationalism in China. And
Hmm.
the Chinese Communist Party also refers to the 100 years of humiliation, which is when the foreign
Yeah.
powers dominated China, and that seems to be very deep, and they want to demonstrate that they are better than the West. They can produce better products. They can put a man on the moon. They can do all of the things that an advanced sort of
Yeah.
industrial economy like the U.S. and the Western countries have done. They want to show that they can do it too.
Yeah. I want to pick up on what you just said about their 100 years of uh, sort of being trampled on by the West, and now they're in the midst of what, well, the author Michael Pillsbury, and I know you read much of his other
Mm-hmm.
writing, but he's recently published a book called The 100-Year Marathon: China's Secret Strategy to Replace America and the Global as the Global Superpower. Um, they they have reference to this 100-year marathon, and you mentioned in China's Energy Dream uh, something called Tianxia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, but it's
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
mandate of heaven. Now, in most Western countries, there's patriotism. Uh, you know, most countries like to pride themselves in something or other. Whether it's the Swiss in their monetary and banking system, or the Scots in their whiskey, or the Americans in probably unfortunately way too many different things. Um, but there seems to be something a little different about Tianxia, this mandate of heaven. Um, Explain that for our listeners. It's not a concept that I had encountered, certainly not in any depth, until the last couple of years.
Well, I think it goes back a long, long way. Uh, to the emperors that all within their sphere should be managed by them. And China, the sphere that is being defined now by President Xi is the globe. And I think it's based on this sense that they have a right, almost an obligation, because they are a long civilization um, with lots of value, lots of discoveries in the past, and that they almost have a right. And I think this conflicts with our notion of our countries. Um, the U.S. of course came out of revolution, um, and I think our relationships with each other and the way we relate to the world is based on this sense of equality. And
Hmm.
um, you treat me equally, I will treat you equally. And so, for example,
Yeah.
we often in Probe talk about the idea that one of our board members, Jane Jacobs, uh, introduced to us many years ago about defining nations as either raiding nations or trading nations. And I think
Hmm.
that it's very useful to look at China this way. The US is a trading nation, Canada is a trading nation, Western Europe is a trading bloc. Um, we and what is this? Well, this is an acceptance of the rule of law and rules,
Hmm.
and we will make agreements based on those rules. And when we have disagreements, we have recourse to courts and arbitration panels and so on. But there's an acceptance that if you accept these rules, that we will all be better off, that all boats will rise with this tide. um,
Hmm.
I, I don't think that the Chinese Communist Party is. I know it is not a trading nation. It is a raiding nation. They are, I would say, pretending to trade, but they really are raiding. They steal, they cheat, they lie, they kidnap. Uh, they don't honor treaties that they've signed. They don't
They
follow
enslave.
rules. They enslave. Uh, so they don't see a value in having common rules that you both accept. Their approach is dominance, uh, not sort of excellence through um, innovation, through competition, through equality before the law. It is a different mindset, and it's dangerous, I think, and most unfortunate. It is especially unfortunate for the people in China.
Yeah.
They have a difficult time of it, living with such arbitrary power. It's very hard on them.
And you are distinguishing between the Chinese government, which is, of course, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese people, many of whom don't embrace the same sort of attitudes toward foreign countries and foreign peoples. Um, I want to pick up on another comment that you make in China's Energy Dreams. Uh, you write just on the first page following the executive uh, summary that China's insistence on language that endorsed continued fossil fuel use. This is at the COP26 in Glasgow and various other settings. China insists on continuing to use fossil fuels, has its roots partly in Xi Jinping's aim for China to become the world superpower by 2049, but partly also in uh, in the fact that without coal, oil, and gas, its economy would underperform, discrediting the legitimacy of communist rule. Now, China produces more solar panels, more wind turbines, and has an almost monopolistic hold on the production, the refinement, the trade of the rare earth minerals that go into those, so that even if you want to produce them in the United States or Canada or Western Europe, you still have to buy the rare earth minerals from China. With so much in the way of renewable energy technology and material resources under their control, why do they need fossil fuels so much?
Well, the renewable energy provides a tiny amount of their energy needs. It's very small. It has increased over the years, but it's still a fraction of what they need. Close to 87% of their energy is coming from fossil fuels. It's a lot of energy that they need, and they're growing. And one of the problems, of course, is that China doesn't have oil. It's got some legacy fields. It's trying to extract as much out of those legacy fields as they can, but it's not nearly keeping up with the growth in demand. So they're importing more and more oil, and the estimates are that by 2030 they're probably going to need about 80% of their oil will have to come from foreigners.
Hmm.
And there are all kinds of problems associated with that. Solar and wind power have a place. It's a very small place at the moment in all of our energy worlds. And the reason for that is because they're not reliable. And we don't have batteries that are sufficient to store the energy that comes from the wind or from the sun. And that's why the solar power and wind power continues to contribute just a tiny fraction of
Yeah,
the energy needs of all of our economies. And in China, they have all kinds of additional problems with their wind power. They're not connected to the grid. They're poorly placed. The blades are not properly established for the circumstances that they're operating in. Huge levels of curtailment
I understand,
of
in
wind
fact, that
power.
a fair amount of their renewable energy is sort of uh, window dressing. It's there in order
Absolutely.
to show
Yeah.
Westerners who visit, and it doesn't really contribute much at all to their actual energy grid.
Absolutely. What's driving the economy is coal, oil, and gas, and increasingly petrochemicals that are coming from coal. They're expanding their syngas
Hmm.
industry enormously, so that and there's logic to this because they have a very serious pollution problem. We've all seen pictures of the smog in Chinese cities, and the more that they can get away from coal and over to oil and gas and synthetic fuels, the cleaner burning it will be. So what they tend to be doing is, for example, in the case of petrochemicals, is they've got very large facilities in the western part of the country where they're converting coal into various petrochemicals in order to burn them in the cities along the eastern seaboard, where they have serious environmental problems. Let me say that I think that the energy policy of the Chinese government is actually quite sensible. I think the economy is run very poorly. I think their energy sector is run very poorly. They run into all kinds of sort of central planning chaotic snafus. But I think they've got the right idea. The basis of an industrial economy is going to be fossil fuels. And we are sort of trapped in this delusion that somehow we're going to get by with wind and solar. It's not going to happen. And so China is quite happy to let us be deluded. It's handicapping
Yeah.
our economies, and it may be a double win for them if we buy the solar panels from them, which are never going to meet our energy needs. So, I think that the Chinese government's energy policy is not crazy. It's a good one.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant in many ways. We have a
Mhm.
question from one of our YouTube viewers. He says, he asks you, please, to describe the ways and money China has used to make so many in the West, quote unquote, useful idiots on global warming. Uh, so, if we can kind of take a detour here, would you just do that a bit
Yes.
for us?
Yes. So I would say over the last 2 years, it's become very obvious to the world that China has a brutal approach to dealing with other countries. They don't like a policy that the Australian government comes out with, so they stop importing Australian coal and wine and so on. And they did the same thing to Canada. And of course, they arrested the two Michaels because we arrested Meng Wanzhou on an extradition request from the U.S. Um, so they use.
Maybe need to explain that a little bit because that's not familiar to me
Okay.
anyway.
Oh, Meng Wanzhou is the CFO of Huawei, the national champion telecommunications company, and she was accused of defrauding one of their banks that she was getting a loan from, HSBC, and the U.S. Department of Justice put
Oh yeah,
out an extradition order and request. They discovered that she was coming through Vancouver in Canada.
that's right.
This is,
Yeah,
I believe, the 2019 or maybe it was 2018. And so when they requested her extradition or her arrest, and so the Canadian authorities arrested her at the airport, and she was under house arrest until very recently when she negotiated a deferred prosecution agreement. And within a couple of days after her arrest, the Chinese government arrested two innocent Canadians and put them in
hmm,
jail. And they were only released within about 24 hours after Meng Wanzhou was on an airplane going back to China.
yeah,
She
yeah.
admitted to her guilt to having defrauded HSBC. It's available on the internet for everybody to see her deferred prosecution agreement. Um, and it's very interesting how it all happened. Of course, along the way, the Chinese government insisted that the two Canadians, they were both named Michael, and so they became known as the two
Uh-huh.
Michaels,
Yeah,
that they were guilty of national security infractions and so on, which was, of course, just totally made up. They were entirely innocent. And they were kidnapped basically by the Chinese government and held hostage as long as Meng Wanzhou was under house arrest. She lived, by the way, in Vancouver. She owned two homes, big mansions, and she lived in one of them under house arrest. She was free to move around. She had an ankle bracelet. She had all her staff with her. She was really living in very comfortable circumstances, had the best legal team that Canada you could get in Canada to defend her. They tried every way to have her case thrown out. Many Canadian politicians lobbied to have the Canadian government intervene and send her back to China because we were just running dogs of the United States and so on. Anyway,
yeah,
the Canadian government did not do that. The courts followed the rule of law, and in the end, she admitted her guilt. And after that,
yeah.
she was released.
Well, that's an interesting illustration, I think, example of the difference between what you described as trading nations and raiding nations. What she was doing over here was frankly raiding, and the trading nations, because they respect the rule of law, Canada and the United States, though we are separate nations, we're independent of each other, nonetheless, we respect each other's legal systems. And so, therefore, Canada was willing to cooperate with our legal system in bringing criminal charges against somebody and then moving toward a fair and just trial on those charges. Whereas China instead just says, oh, you've retained this person who's Chinese. Well, we're going to retain these two people who are Canadian. And
Yeah, yeah.
it's a very, very different mentality. And her willingness to acknowledge that, in fact, she did do the thievery of which she was accused. Uh, I think to most Western thinkers, we see that and we think, mustn't she be ashamed of herself? But at least in the Chinese government's sort of worldview, anyway, deception is a very important part of life. And Pillsbury addresses
Yes,
that at
yes.
some depth in his book, The 100-Year Marathon. And you've read a lot of his articles. Can you help our listeners to understand that part of Chinese culture?
Well, the Chinese citizens that I've worked with are not like that. They
Okay.
um, I think it is more a Communist Party
Okay.
characteristic. Um, and I think for 30 years, the West has been deceived into
Hmm.
thinking that China is a trading nation. And
Uh-huh.
I think interestingly, it was, if for, at least for Canadians, it was the arrest of the two Michaels that that shone a bright light on the true nature of China. I think suddenly people understood this is not a
Yeah.
government that you can trade with, that you can deal with on normal terms, and and people now talk about us being in a Cold War. I think we are in a Cold
Yeah.
War with China, and it's really most unfortunate because I think that China as a country, if it had democracy, if it had rule of law, and they have some of the world's best lawyers, I would say, who are defending the law um, in their country and defending individuals who are not receiving justice, and they end up in jail. They are truly the bravest people I have ever met.
Hmm.
So I don't. I think this is more a Communist Party problem than it
Hmm.
is a Chinese characteristic.
Interesting that
So
they would have to be brave to do what they're doing as lawyers. And you'd say that the bravest people you've ever met. I'm not sure that we would typically say that about lawyers
I know.
practicing in the West. You don't have to be all that brave.
Quite right, and in fact, think of all the lawyer jokes, and people often think that lawyers are there to to use the law to take advantage of you. So,
Yeah.
and I often will send stories about these Chinese lawyers to lawyers I know, and say these people are going to save China. They are
Hmm.
they are principled, they are determined, they're not going to give up. There are not very many of them compared to all the other lawyers who are not doing this, but they are so admirable, and they are getting
Hmm.
at what's right. Um, so, I, as I say, I don't think it's. I think it's a Communist Party problem, and I think it's because they're insecure. They don't trust
Hmm.
their own people. That's why they have to
Uh-huh.
watch them with the social credit scores. That's why they have
Hmm.
cameras everywhere. They don't trust the public, uh, and I think you have to wonder if in fact there were democracy in that country, what would happen to the Communist Party leaders? They probably would be put on trial. So
Yeah.
they are fighting for their lives, but they're doing so by oppressing the people. And
Yeah.
it's not, to me, it's not a sustainable situation.
Um, we are at 49 minutes into what's usually
Okay.
about an hour-long program, and I want to be respectful of your time. If you need to quit at the top of the hour, we can do that. But if you're available to stay with me for another 15 to perhaps even 30 minutes, I'd be grateful because
Yes,
there are more things in your papers here that I want to talk about. Is that all right?
that would be fine. That's fine. Actually, I
Okay.
don't think I answered the question from the person who asked it, which is the
Yeah.
useful idiots. Um,
Yeah.
I think the environmental movement needs China. The Western environmental movement needs China to say it cares about climate change and it's going to go carbon neutral, and by whatever year, to 2030, 2060. Because the moment China says, look, we're not going to play this game, then there's no more campaign, because China is the biggest emitter, and
Okay. Yeah.
it is the end of the climate change campaign if the
Yeah.
biggest emitter withdraws from it. So they need to keep the fiction going, and the Chinese government is very happy to keep that fiction going for the reasons
But
that we've discussed. So they
is,
serve each other
yeah.
very
Is
very
the mask
handily.
is the mask falling off? China's role at Glasgow back in November was one that made it pretty doggone clear they have no intention whatsoever of making any strides toward even leveling off their CO2 emissions and their use of fossil fuels, let alone reducing them, moving toward net zero, anything of that sort. I mean, they could talk about maybe trying to do that toward 2060, but I mean, my goodness, who believes any government's promises about something that's 40 years in the future?
Yeah.
That's just
Mm-hmm.
insane.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So is the facade beginning to come down?
Yes, I think it is. And in fact, if you look at the analysis that used to come out from different Western environmental organizations and universities, and they were working very closely with the Chinese government to sort of
Hmm.
finesse ways that they could reduce carbon. And it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. I mean, the Chinese government was stringing them along, and I
Yeah,
suspect they knew that. But a lot of that sort of detailed analysis has started to fall by the wayside, and you don't see it as much anymore. And it really is just you get the basic from the environmental organizations that they're disappointed that the Chinese government is building another 49 massive coal facilities and so on. They
yeah,
they will criticize the Chinese government and say they really have to do better. But I think slowly but surely it is starting to wind down for two reasons. One
yeah,
is because China's making it very clear. I mean, since Paris, we're now 7 years. It's very obvious that they are not reducing their uses of fossil fuels in absolute terms. It's just growing. It has to grow. You know,
yeah,
the economy needs those fossil fuels to continue to grow, and they need to grow to employ people. So it for that reason, it's not going to. I think the public is not going to go for this argument that China is going to be net zero. Not going to go along with it anymore.
yeah, yeah. Um, okay. One of the things that I'd like you to talk about a bit is the degree to which China has controlling positions within the United Nations, and particularly within the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Uh, just let me read just a bit here from you. You say the co-chair of the working group of the UN IPCC, which in August 2021 produced a 4,000-page document declaring the need for strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and reaching net zero CO2 emissions, is an appointee of the Chinese Communist Party. 3 of the 15 UN specialized agencies are headed by Chinese nationals, including the Food and Agricultural Organization, the International Telecommunication Union, and which, by the way, of course, has an enormous amount to do with wireless networks and so on. Uh, the the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and since 2007, the position of Undersecretary General for the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs has been held by Chinese career diplomats, giving Beijing opportunities to reshape the UN's development programs in accordance with its interests. Um, and then you also mentioned the influence that it has in the High Commission for Human Rights and the UN Human Rights Council. Uh, Enlarge on that a bit for us, and particularly on the difference between the Chinese government's concept of human rights and Western concepts of human rights.
Yes, their definition of human rights is that you can't have human rights without development. So the notion that we have, which is that an individual has rights that all governments must respect, is they reject. Now, what's
Mm,
interesting in their takeover of UN institutions, but not just the UN, also the one that concerns me a great deal is Interpol, which we can talk about in
mm,
a minute, um,
yeah,
is is that they're using the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, which is this $1 trillion infrastructure program where they are building all manner of infrastructure projects around the world, from roads to ports to airports, all kinds of things. And many of those are geared to protect the transshipment of oil and gas into China.
Hmm.
But they are using the Belt and Road Initiative as a way of basically buying off governments, so that when it
Hmm.
comes to votes at the UN to put a Chinese representative in as the Secretary General, or the head of this institution or that institution, or changing, for example, the human rights, the definition of human rights, that's where they start pulling levers, um, because in many cases they've been able to curry favor with probably especially third world nations, um, and and many investigations have now gone into the extent to which they are taking over these international institutions. Your own ambassador to the UN has called their influence malign. Um, a UK House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee did the same thing, using exactly the same word, malign. They said China is taking over these institutions and using them to suit its own authoritarian purposes. And these institutions were formed really to make the world a better place, and China's
Hmm.
rolling that back. I mentioned
Hmm.
Interpol. It's especially worrying. There's a fellow
Yeah.
who has just been um, uh, put in place in one of the executive committees, who's very powerful. He's from the Ministry of Public Security, which is basically it's the police in China, and there are very real worries that they are going to use it, as they have in the past, use it to put out their notices for Chinese people that they don't like. So this could be
Hmm.
um, um, people who know a lot from the Communist Party but have left the country, so they can put out extradition requests for them. It could be dissidents, it could be all kinds of people. And a couple of
Yeah.
studies have just come out from Safeguard Defenders, a wonderful group based in Europe, documenting the threats not only to mainland Chinese citizens who would now be outside of the country, but also the citizens of Hong Kong, who are very much at risk now. So
Yeah.
it's a very worrying development, and really what's doing it is money. They're buying they're buying people. They're buying governments, and
Yeah.
there's something else if I could add. Many of the great Chinese intellectuals and dissidents and people who are speaking about human rights abuses in the country have said that one of the very serious problems is Western companies who accept the
Yeah.
government, the Chinese Communist Party, who will go
Yeah.
into China and use really what amounts to slave labor. It's
Yeah.
people whose salaries are kept low, who don't have civil rights, and they're it's sort of a greed and self-interest that is driving Western companies into the country to establish their investments, and taking advantage of an undemocratic government. So they don't like their government, but they also don't like Western companies doing this either.
Yeah.
They say this blame should go there too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because, um, for a couple of decades anyway, it was very popular in the West for people to protest against Western companies that employed uh, poor people in, say, Thailand or Vietnam or Bangladesh, uh, in often in textile work, shoemaking, things like that, at wages that are extremely low by comparison with those in America or Canada, but that actually were pretty respectable by comparison with surrounding wages in those countries. Um, and yet, now I look at those situations and I say the important question for an economist is compared to what? As in, if they weren't doing that work, what work would they be doing? And some studies done of what happened when some of these Western companies stopped employing people in particularly these Southeast Asian nations was that a whole lot of the workers losing those jobs wound up in sex traffic, and that was
Right.
sort of the next best thing for them as the alternatives were available. And yet now it seems like so many of these same people have just become silent about what's happening in China with
Hmm.
the exploitation, the real oppression of so many workers who aren't working voluntarily in what they're doing, but are forced to it and still at practically slave wages. What do you think has happened to so many of these Westerners in how they
Hmm.
are thinking about China versus how they thought about Thailand or Bangladesh and companies working with those?
Well, I know the environmental groups the best, and I think their jobs depend on China being a
Hmm.
participant in the climate change negotiations.
Hmm.
So they are very willing to turn a blind eye to the fact that China's word doesn't count for anything. You know, they don't they don't seem to they don't seem to mind that China doesn't abide by its international treaties and it doesn't live up to its word. It doesn't seem to matter to them, and I can only think that it's fear of losing their own jobs. Um,
Hmm.
when it comes to labor standards, it's not a field I know as well, but I think another way to look at this is what would salaries be, for example, in China, if if people had civil rights, if
Yeah.
they had freedom of movement around the country, if they were free to negotiate with
Yeah.
employers, um, and I think you would probably find different salaries, and they would probably be
Yeah.
higher. Um,
Yeah.
so so there are all kinds of complex conditions that the Chinese Communist Party enforces in order to control the movement of people and the availability of people and the conditions under which they work. And I think in many cases people do want to move from the rural areas, and of course we would all feel that that's a fair decision. If they want to do that,
Sure.
they should be
Sure.
they should be allowed to do that and to take jobs. The issue really is it comes boils down to one of civil rights. I think. Do they have civil
Hmm.
rights? They don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, okay. So one of the uh, one of the concerns that you have that you've written about pretty extensively is exactly how China uses climate policy as a weapon against free Western nations. And um, so I was just glancing back through this and I can't find the exact quote at the moment, but I think you quoted possibly Sun Tzu about um, the best way to win a battle is without having to fight, and you get your enemy to defeat itself. Uh, how would this how would this happen? How does China envision this happening with Western nations becoming increasingly dependent on wind, solar, and other renewables instead of fossil fuels? How would that be getting them to defeat themselves?
Well, Canada is a good example. We had an oil and gas industry that has been, I wouldn't say destroyed, but it has been severely weakened by our government, who believes that we should get off fossil fuels. I'm sure the Chinese government loves that.
Yeah,
Our economy has suffered greatly because of this policy. Um, People have lost their jobs. Um, we don't have the same exports that we had before. I mean, our economy has been weakened by this policy, which the Chinese government is encouraging everybody else to pursue, but not itself. So it's a general weakening, I would say, um,
Hmm.
of the economy. I mean, they can try to sell us solar panels and wind turbines and so on, but they're very limited. There's not going to be a
Yeah.
big market for that. Of course, one of the other ways that the Chinese government tries to control us is by monopolizing, as you mentioned, for example, rare earths. Rare earths are not rare. It's just that they're hard to mine. They're dirty, very polluting, and so on. But they're not rare. So I think we all need a
And
policy of
if I may interrupt for a moment there too. So what we do is we forbid mining and refining them here in Western countries where we would have
yes,
very strong environmental regulations that would prevent a
right.
whole lot of pollution from that. And instead, it gets done in China that doesn't have those strong nature protecting regulations. And so,
Yeah.
in the process of our caring about the earth, supposedly, we're actually winding up with more harm done to the earth because it's being done
Hmm.
over there. And that then makes me
Hmm.
wonder a little bit about just how much are we loving our neighbors? Uh, do we only care about whether we have a clean, healthful environment? And not care at all about whether the Chinese do or what.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. I know that the Canadian government has just approved the sale of a lithium company, a Canadian company, to a Chinese company, and people in Canada are just absolutely scratching their heads and saying, "What are they thinking?" This is
Yeah.
China uses this as a weapon to get compliance from us. We
Hmm.
must not put ourselves in this position. We do need to extract ourselves from whatever dependencies we have. If it's on rare earths, it's in pharmaceuticals, whatever it happens to be, we need to disengage from China. But
Yeah.
I agree with you. Although I think people are very concerned. For example, a lot of these solar panels are being made in Xinjiang. Well, you
Yes.
know, and now you in your country have a legislation which is going to prohibit the importation of any goods that have been made with slave labor. Great. We need
Yeah.
we need something like that in Canada as well. So people do care. Part of the problem is getting the information, knowing what
Yeah.
those connections are. And it's very, very hard right now. And in China, because any environmental group, for example, that operates inside China now has to be monitored by public security, which is basically the police. And they have to be
Yeah.
watched by a government department. So it's only it's only
Yeah.
those NGOs that are prepared to toe the government line, the Communist Party government line, who are going to get in there. So they're going to be very careful in the kind of
Yeah.
information
Yeah.
that they convey to the rest of the world.
Yeah. Further on the weaponization of climate policy, so to speak, um,
Hmm.
we can talk about the weakening of economies, but national security, I think, is something that most people don't immediately think about when they think of a weakening economy, although it ought to be fairly obvious. Very wealthy nations can afford better defense systems than very poor nations, and so that's an issue for sure. But there are some national security issues that are more obvious. One would be, for example, the fact that I've forgotten the precise numbers now, but out of something like 20 different strategic minerals that are absolutely essential to America's defense industry for the making of the various weapons that we use, fighter planes and tanks and missiles and things like that. We are now 100% dependent on China for the import of, I
Hmm.
think it's over 80% of the strategic minerals that the United States depends on. So, I mean, all they need to do to hamper our defense industry very quickly and
Yes.
our military is just simply to cut off the export of those minerals. But the other issue, and this one, I mean, that would have a sort of a delayed effect because, of course, we already have quite a few fighters and bombers and the tanks and the like. Uh, so its effect would be delayed. But a more immediate effect happens when you have a collapse of an electricity grid.
Right.
And
Right.
how
Yeah.
does our shifting dependence from fossil fuels, especially coal and natural gas, to wind and solar, threaten the the reliability of the electric grid on which defense communications depend?
Right. Well, there are two issues there. I think one is the effect of solar and wind on a grid, and they are very destabilizing because they're erratic. Um, so, not a good idea to have an electricity system that's dependent on it. I think the Texas demonstrated that when they had their cold snap, I guess last
Mm-hmm.
year. So you don't you absolutely must have reliability. You're not going to get that from solar and wind. And then there's the other issue, which is cybersecurity. And of
Yeah.
course, China is now famous for hacking. They hack all kinds of things. I remember years ago they were hacking Indian naval movements, and and of course we know that they are hacking into all kinds of things, and I think the U.S. has done the right thing in putting in restrictions on who can work where, who's hired, investigating what they're actually doing. This has to be done. If you've got spies who are either stealing technology or are stealing sensitive national security information, you've got to find them. Same thing in Canada. We've got to find them, and I would say that our government has been extremely lax in this, and our national security institutions have really not done what they should do. So these are two issues. Now, just to add also that the Chinese military is very large. Their navy is the largest in the world. It's probably not as good quality, almost certainly not as good quality as the
So
American
far.
navy, and not as battle ready. They're not as tested. They don't have the experience. But that should not give us pause, because they're continuing to spend a lot of money expanding their military, and what they're doing through the Belt and Road Initiative uh, is securing the routes to ensure that they can get oil and gas. There are three choke points through which the marine traffic goes that's carrying oil and gas. They are extremely worried about those choke points. They're all controlled by other countries. And so, what China is doing is building port facilities in what they call a string of pearls along these various routes so that they can have ships there who will be ready to um, be ready to defend any of the Chinese or any of the shipments that are going into China. This is one of the reasons why China's trying to develop overland routes as well, pipelines from Russia, from Central Asia, from Burma. And this is to provide them with some sort of security other than these marine routes, which they're extremely worried about. I mean, they depend on imported oil and gas, and it, vast majority of it's coming through on ships through these along these marine routes, which are controlled by other countries.
Okay, this has been, I think, fascinating, and uh, there are many other things in your papers that I would love for us to talk about, um, but we are getting well past our usual amount of time.
Okay.
Um, I, I want though for you, please, now to take a few minutes to say, okay, so what can we do? What can ordinary people, citizens in Western countries, do about this? And what should our governments be doing about China using climate policy as a weapon to impoverish and to weaken, in terms of national security, military defense capabilities, the West?
Well, there are many things that we can do. Um, Generally, I would say we need to disengage. Um,
Hmm.
I think that U.S. has done the best job in identifying the problems, alerting the world to the abuses that China has engaged in for the last 30 years. It's been a real eye opener, I think, for everyone, and that's been very valuable. Um, I think we need to recognize Taiwan. I would recognize Tibet. I would try to buy products that come from countries other than China. I think with respect to climate change, I think what we need to do is be sensible and and realize that our economies run on fossil fuels. Let me add that when you burn a fossil fuel, you get a lot of nasty emissions, NOx, SOx, particulates, things that will kill people and do kill people in China, maybe as many as 500,000 a year. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of very nasty stuff that comes out of tailpipes and smokestacks, but you can contain them. And we have contained them in the West. And the
Right.
reason we
Right.
contained them is because we have democracies and we have the rule of law. And the public says to the politicians, I'm not going to breathe that stuff. I don't want to breathe it. It's hurting me and my children and my
Yeah.
family. And so the politicians bring in policies to have scrubbers and catalytic converters and whatever else to contain the emissions. And so if you look at the statistics over the last 30, 40 years, as fossil fuel consumption has gone up, GDP has gone up, CO2 emissions have gone up, but the killer pollutants, what I would call the killer pollutants, have gone down.
Yeah.
CO2 is not a killer.
Hugely.
And
Hugely they've gone
I
down.
think
Like well over
yeah,
99%
hugely.
for most of them. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what the public in China wants. They want rule of law so that they can
Yeah.
protect their health and the health of their children and their families. They don't have it. They have no tools available to them to enforce this accountability, either on the companies or the politicians. So I think what we have to do here is recognize that we are going to continue to consume fossil fuels. They are the basis of our modern economy. It doesn't
Hmm.
mean that we have to pollute. We don't have to. But CO2 is
Right.
not a pollutant. And I think that the public knows this. I think it's the politicians are just in the thrall of a few environmentalists. I think it's changing. I hope it changes
Yeah.
because our economies are suffering greatly from these policies. And I think ultimately, I think prices are going to go up. It's going to be more costly to heat our homes and run our automobiles and our transportation systems, and so on, and our factories. And
Yeah.
factories will leave. They're already leaving Ontario. We had a massive program to go green. Electricity prices doubled, and we started losing a lot of factories and businesses. So, and the
Yeah.
same thing happened in Europe. So I think when this happens, then people start to get sensible, and they bring in governments that will be sensible.
One hopes. Yes, indeed.
One
Uh,
hopes.
right. Uh, okay. Last question for you. Uh, in addition to your own writings on this, particularly China's energy dream, which, by the way, again, I'll remind our viewers, throughout the month of January, the Cornwall Alliance will very happily send a free copy of Patricia Adams's China's Energy Dream, which we've been discussing tonight, to you as our way of saying thank you when you make a tax-deductible donation of literally any size, doesn't matter how large or how small, and ask for it. So if you'd like to have a copy of this really outstanding, very enlightening paper, and we've only barely touched the surface of it tonight, just go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just write in promo code 22-01. That's promo code 22-01, or the title, China's Energy Dream. We'll be glad to send you a free copy, and 100% of your donation will be tax deductible. Again, though, thank you again to Patricia for joining us tonight. And my last question of you is this. In addition to those things, what would you recommend to our viewers as perhaps the top two or three things that you've been reading that have helped you to grasp what this problem is in terms of China, climate policy, national security, uh, China's efforts to weaken the West and strengthen itself?
Well, there are many good things out there to read. I would recommend the recent publications of Safeguard Defenders. They're terrific.
Mm,
They are led by a man who was himself in jail in China,
mm.
and their research is terrific. Um, as for other material, I tend to read everything, including the official media that comes from China. I read it all, um, and I read trade journals, um, not just the human rights works, which are themselves very good, but um, economists who are writing about China. And as I say, the trade journals have very interesting information in them about um, what's happening on the ground. And I would also
Mm.
recommend um, that people do some research and maybe Google the 709 lawyers in China who are so very brave, and should be supported.
709, is that 709 or is it 70 and 9? What?
It's the three numbers 709, and it signifies the day of the first crackdown on them.
Okay.
Um,
All right.
which I think was, it must have been July 9th, and I've forgotten the year. It might have been 2015. And they're known as the
Okay.
709 lawyers. It's a
Lawyers.
sort of a loose movement within China, and they're so admirable.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Patricia, thank you again for joining us. I'm going to continue to watch your writings and hope we might be able to connect again in the future. I commend you for your work. It is, I think it's just outstanding scholarship, but it's also outstanding just in terms of your care for uh, for defending freedom and the rule of law in Western countries and wanting to see those expand into China and other countries that don't yet enjoy that. So thank you very much for all your work. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and God bless you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right. All right. Friends, thanks again for joining us tonight, and look forward to seeing you next week on From the Stacks.